So today we're talking about proximity. And we're going to look at the proximity principle, and we're going to watch a video about that. Proximity is kind of a buzzword right now, and in the educational circles, it's a buzzword that teachers need to be within about 75 feet of each other, or they feel very alone. So you need to have your classroom close enough to another classroom that you still see some adults once in a while for adult interaction at school. And I don't know if we have a lot of educators that, if that do you get that? No, you're like, no, I don't want to be anywhere near those teachers. Yeah, wouldn't it be nice to have some adult contact once in a while? And so they're doing some research on this, and they're actually changing the way they build schools based on this proximity principle. But it doesn't just stop there. The proximity principle is also, it's an architectural term. It's also now a marketing term. Like, this is why when you walk into Target, your phone buzzes and you get notice that Target knows that you're there and they want to give you a 10% off coupon if you haven't set your privacy things close enough. Some of you are like, I don't get that on my flip phone. Probably don't. And I can just say, I envy you for that. But there's this idea that Google knows where we are, and therefore the people marketing to us know where we are. And it's super convenient if you want everybody to know where you are all the time. But that's not what we're talking about today. There's also kind of a biblical proximity thing. We just celebrated the season of proximity. God came near. Emmanuel, God is with us. He's in proximity to us. But today we're going to look at that from the standpoint of being near others. Carnegie put out some research just recently talking about this proximity principle as it relates to understanding poverty, understanding race, understanding one another. And so I want you to take a look. I don't know if you're going to relate completely to this video as Kyle Idleman stands in a skyscraper and overlooks the city around him. I don't know that we have a lot of people in our church, maybe one that works in a building like that where you can overlook the community around you. But don't miss the principle that he's sharing. I think it's an important principle that we need to find a way to overcome what separates us from one another so that we can grow in this Christian life together. Let's play the video.
You gotta love the view from up here. There's something about being in a tall building overlooking a city, and everything just is more beautiful from up here. From up here, you don't notice the trash. You can't see the rundown buildings and the broken windows. And from up here, things smell good, right? Like you don't get the same stench that can sometimes knock you over when you're down there. From up here, there's not much noise. There's not the kind of noise that just comes when you're too close to too many people. From up here, there's no one to hit you up for a few bucks. There's no one to honk at you because you're going too slow. And so from up here, you don't have to think about, well, all the people and all of their problems down there. Up here, things are comfortable. Down there, things are crowded. Up here, things are peaceful. Down there, they're stressful. Up here, you can relax. Down there, you're more on edge. Up here, you can do things your way, but down there, other people get in your way. Up here, things are clean. Down there, things are messy. And it seems to me that most people spend their lives trying to get up here. People who are down there look up here and wonder what life would be like. It certainly seems easier up here than down there. And I think a lot of us who want to make a difference with our lives, we live with this tension. We want to make a difference in the world. We want to make a difference in the city, but we want to do it from up here. And I guess what I would say is that impacting people one at a time, it's pretty hard to do from up here. It happens down there. It happens in the streets. So I think for a lot of us, we can be like the person who loves to read novels but doesn't really have their own story to tell, or loves to watch action movies but has never really felt the adrenaline of our own adventure, loves to look at maps but rarely gets out of the house and never really leaves town. And as we study the stories of life change that are recorded in the Gospels, I don't know about you, but there's something in me that comes alive where I want to have those stories to tell. I want to have that kind of impact. I want to make that kind of difference out there. There's a phrase that should be a pretty good clue to us about how it happens. It's a phrase that shows up in the Gospels, or at least some variation of it shows up a number of times. The phrase is along the way. And what you'll notice is that so many of the one-at-a-time stories that happen in Scripture happen along the way, right? Like Jesus is on the way somewhere when he meets someone. Might even seem like an interruption, but it's someone who has a question or someone who has a need, someone who's confused or someone who's hurting. And I would just say most of the time, one-at-a-time stories begin along the way when you get out of the house, when you get out of the office. And if you just stopped spending so much time up here and spent more time down there, you might be surprised at the one-at-a-time opportunities that come your way. So I remember a few years ago, I was sitting in an alley just outside of Skid Row in South Central LA. And I was sitting on the curb listening to a story about this elderly woman from the Midwest who had come with her church, actually on a mission trip, and had become lost. So if you're in charge of that mission trip, having an elderly lady lost in South Central LA is a pretty scary proposition. She didn't know where she was at, and she's in this alley, and she sees a guy walking towards her, kind of this big, scary-looking dude, and you might think the right thing for her to do in that moment would be just to turn around and run away. Maybe not run away, because she's at an age where speed walking at the mall was maybe more of a thing, but at least get out of there as quickly as possible. And yet she doesn't do that. She starts walking towards him. And this guy, turns out, was a member of a gang. He had been a hired gun. He had spent time in prison. Since the age of 12, he had been involved in this life of drugs and violence. In fact, he had just gotten out of prison earlier that same day. And now she's walking towards him and she talks to him. And he's kind of thrown off by this. And he's the guy who's telling me the story. His name's Alfred Lomas. And he said, I just wasn't expecting her to start talking to me. And she introduced herself and said hello. And then she asked him if he was hungry. He said he was hungry. And she said, well, if you show me where I am, if you help me know where to go, I'm lost. If you help me with this, I'll help you get some food. And she took him to a place called the Dream Center, where Alfred got some food, and he ended up spending about a year in a program there for guys like him. And while he was there, he experienced the life-changing love of Jesus. Alfred takes me around and he shows me what God is doing in South Central LA, where he now oversees efforts to bring food to people who are hungry. And he also helps bring peace between rival gangs. The city of Los Angeles has spent tens of millions of dollars and passed numerous laws trying to do something about the violence in that part of the town. But Alfred is making a difference on the streets, and he's doing it one person at a time, because that's how Jesus reached him in the most unlikely of ways, through an elderly lady from the Midwest who got lost in an alley. On the night Jesus was arrested to be crucified, he spent some time with his closest followers, and he talked to them about his will for their lives. In John chapter 14, we read about some of his final words to them. After explaining to them that he would no longer be with them, he reminds them of his primary purpose. He says in John 14, verse 34, "A new command I give you, love one another." It's not a new suggestion, it's not a new idea or a new proposition or a new recommendation. Jesus says, this is my command for you. But why does Jesus call it new? Because it's not new. Like, loving other people was often his central message. What Jesus says next is what makes it new. He says, as I have loved you, so you must love one another. And Jesus had shown them a new way to love. In fact, the disciples hear these words, I think, differently because they hear these words with freshly washed feet. Moments earlier, Jesus had knelt down and humbly washed the dust and the dirt and the grime out from between their toes. They knew what he meant when he told them his will was for them to love others the way he had loved them. It's a love that puts others' needs ahead of our own. It's the kind of love that considers others better than ourselves. It's the kind of love that doesn't insist on its own way. It's the kind of love that doesn't keep a record of wrongs. I think one of the words that best describes the love of Jesus is this word, okay? Proximity. Proximity. At Christmas, we celebrate that Jesus loved us enough to come and be with us. That's what the word Emmanuel means. It means proximity, God with us. The incarnation of Christ, Jesus coming to earth, makes it clear that the way he loved us required proximity. It's hard to love someone if you're determined to keep your distance. If you want to live a life of impact, it requires proximity. You've got to do life down here. And as you do life down here, I can promise you that along the way, you will begin to have some one-at-a-time stories. Mark chapter 5 is an example of this. Earlier in that day, Jesus had been teaching a large crowd that had gathered around him. He spent the day teaching, but that evening, he came to his disciples and he said, hey guys, let's go over to the other side of the lake. I guess what's surprising about that is on the other side of the lake is what is called the Gerasene region, which was typically a place good Jews would avoid. But they get in a boat and they cross over at night and they get caught in this terrifying storm. And when they finally arrive, they don't stay very long. In fact, they just stay a couple of hours. They just had one thing to do before they turned around and went back. And just for a moment, that was a lot of work for one thing, right? They risked a lot for one thing, but that one thing was one man. A guy whose life was a wreck. He was locked up in a graveyard away from town. People did everything they could to avoid this guy, but Jesus goes out of his way to see him, to be close in proximity to him. And Jesus spends some time with this man, and this man's life is completely changed. He met Jesus, he discovers healing, and his life becomes whole. And I don't know about you, but I want to be able to tell stories like that. I mean, maybe they don't include a near shipwreck and meeting a guy who's been locked up in a graveyard, but I want to be able to tell stories of introducing Jesus to people who have been ignored and overlooked and outcast. And that's what I want for you too. But I'm just telling you, it won't happen by accident. And I mean, it won't happen if you stay up there. It will happen along the way. It will require proximity. A few years ago, I had the privilege of doing a funeral as a pastor for a lady named Brittany, a young lady. In fact, she was 17. I really didn't know her, didn't know much about her, but I was really inspired by her life. And she just had a huge heart for people. Brittany recently, before she passed, had opened up a checking account, and the first and only check she would ever write in her life was made out to Compassion International as she started to support a child. While I was at the house with the mom and dad, her mom brought me a spiral notebook and showed me a prayer that Brittany had written in her journal the night before she died. And I want to read part of her prayer to you. Brittany wrote in her journal, God, I can't fathom how much you feel when one of your children suffers, but I've had a glimpse of your heartache. Please fill me with your wisdom that I won't just watch others suffer, but that I'll be able to say what they need to hear. She wrote, as a new week approaches, my dangerous prayer is that you'll place broken-hearted people in my path and fill me with you so that I can let your love heal their pain. And that's a great prayer for us too. In fact, let's just call it the proximity prayer. If you've been up there, you got to get down here. It means you got to get out of the house, you got to get out of the office, and then every day you pray and you say, God, today would you put people in my path, and would you fill me with you so that your love can heal their pain?
I preached that story one time in a sermon about 3 naked people that met Jesus. And that's the story of this man who's being plagued by demons. And Christ goes to him, and again, you can read this yourself in Mark chapter 4, and we'll certainly look at it today in our message time. But Jesus goes near this man that everybody else avoids, this crazy man, and he lets him come near. And the man's, healed, or these demons are chased off and sent into a whole bunch of, bacon, a bunch of pigs who drown themselves and never get to become bacon. And it stirs up the whole city, but it was all because Jesus took that opportunity to be near this man that nobody else wanted to be near. Kyle goes on to tell this story about a young lady by the name of Brittany, whose funeral he did. And this young lady had been praying a prayer that just basically said, Lord, give me the eyes to see the broken around me and put me in proximity with them. Let me cross the paths of the people that are hurting most. Bring them into my life. And it's a pretty powerful story. I won't try and retell it. It's his story, not mine. But I would encourage you to, if you get a chance this week, I'll post a link. Again, all of this series is on Right Now Media, which you all have access to. It's like Netflix for church growth or for personal Bible study. It's really a great program. I don't know how many of you, do you know Kyle Eidelman? Is this a name you're familiar with? You may not, but I just want to introduce you a little, tell you a little bit about him. 17 years ago, when this church was formed, I believe this is accurate, a man by the name of Bob Russell made a video. Do you remember seeing this video, those of you that were here? Bob Russell preached at Southeast Christian Church in Louisville, Kentucky, which is one of the largest churches in the country. I think it's the 5th largest church in the country. And Bob mentored a guy by the name of David Stone, but 3 years before we started as a church, Bob brought Kyle onto staff, onto the preaching team. Brought him out of LA, where he just talked about, and began to mentor him into ministry, and now he preaches at Southeast in Louisville, Kentucky. So some of you might be familiar with that church or with his mentor. If you want to hear a really good sermon on proximity, Kyle is preaching one right now as we speak. Turns out that they're going through this same series right now there. I didn't know that when we started into this, but if you want to catch that, it's on YouTube or wherever else you like to, find content. But I want to talk about this idea of one at a time, which is really what caught my eye for this series. As I mentioned to you, one of the guys that I really appreciate is a man by the name of Rick Stedman. And he built this church out in California by this simple principle that says when you love people one at a time, they begin to add up after a while. And Rick used to go and set up a little plastic table out in front of the Walmart in Sacramento, California, and just offer prayer and counseling to anybody that needed it. And that's how he met people. And he began to pray for them, and they said, what causes you to do this? He said, well, we have a church for people, and we just care about people one at a time. We care about people, and so we care about you. And that was the way that they started to grow their church and went from 0 to 2,000 in 5 years, Adventure Christian Church. I don't know that that's necessarily our model, but that principle of one at a time, I think, is the key to having a good, strong church. It was certainly the way Jesus did it. So in Mark chapter 5, we get this proximity principle that said Jesus went out, and all the Gospels are set up that way. Starting next week, by the way, we're going to start a series called Beloved. And it's all based on the book of John, the Gospel of John. And so some of you might be like, wait, we're in week 3 of this series. This is a 5-week series, by the way. But we're starting into Beloved next week. How does that work? What about the other 2 weeks? Maybe you've enjoyed this teaching. Well, I'm glad you asked that question. Because starting next week at 10 o'clock in the morning, we're going to start having small groups again. Like this week, we're going to do it at the end of service one more time. But next week at 10 o'clock, we're going to do a small group, and we're going to watch the 4th video in this series and have a little discussion afterwards around the table, have some coffee or whatever. But you'll have a chance to finish the series the next 2 weeks if you come at 10 a.m. And that's to get us used to maybe having some experiences where we're together a little before worship, beginning to build some groups, rebuilding our koinonia groups. And so after those 2 weeks, once we finish this series, we also have a series of prayer meetings that we're going to do at 10 a.m., some listening posts that we talked about in our annual meeting where we want to get some feedback from the congregation. And so I'd really encourage you to think, if you've been coming for our 10:30 service, maybe think about coming for our 10 o'clock service. Like this is all just one service. And I'll make you a deal. If we can get most of our people here at 10 o'clock for that, I will try to have you out by 11:30 for lunch. Deal? Any takers on that? All right. I got 2 weeks to prove that I can do it, but that's the plan. So let's talk about this proximity principle a little bit, and really let's just go into some application. Monday was Martin Luther King Day. I don't know what you did to celebrate that day, but one of the things that I did was I tried to do a little bit of reading and thinking and just evaluating of myself in the midst of that. And as I was thinking about this proximity principle and the application of it, one of the things that I'm still trying to wrap my head around is how can I be near a group of people that I'm so separated from and so different than? And in his book, in the book Free at Last, there's a quote from Martin Luther King Jr. that I think explains some of this struggle and explains some of the need that we have for this proximity principle. And it simply says this: men, and I don't think it's just men, I think it's just that he was speaking this a long time ago. But Dr. King said, men often hate each other because they fear each other. That does sound a lot like men, by the way. But I think it's true for women too. Men often hate each other because they fear each other. And they fear each other because they do not know each other. And I think that's true for my life. Most of the people that I fear most, I really don't know that well. They don't know each other because they cannot communicate. And they cannot communicate because they are separated. And I think Dr. King was definitely onto something when he said that. And I don't think it's changed as much as it needs to change today. I think this is the explanation not only for a lot of the racial tension that we have in our culture, but right now for a lot of the political tension that we have in our culture. And not just in our culture, in our church. In my own social media, or even in my own heart sometimes. In my own heart, I feel separated from people that I don't feel like I can communicate with, and therefore I don't know that well, and therefore I fear. And that fear sometimes comes out as hatred, even when I don't want it to. I think this is a pretty profound statement, and I would encourage you to maybe think about it yourself. I definitely think this is what took place for the Gerasenes, with this crazy naked guy who was chained up outside a town, plagued by demons. I imagine people hated him. They chained him up. You don't usually do that with people you love. They were clearly afraid of him. I don't know if they knew him or not. But if you've ever been around anybody plagued by demons, which in all honesty I have, those people are hard to communicate with. By the way, C.S. Lewis, talking about in the Screwtape Letters, this old book that he wrote a long time ago. If you haven't read the Screwtape Letters, it's probably way better than the Chronicles of Narnia, but not something you read to your kids at night. It's this mentoring of a junior demon by a more experienced demon on how to plague Christians, which sounds super dark, but C.S. Lewis handles it in a pretty lighthearted, interesting way, if you can be lighthearted about demons. But C.S. Lewis in that preface says, people make one of two mistakes when it comes to thinking about evil. First, they think it doesn't exist. Like there is no Satan, there is no demon, there's none of that. The second mistake people make is they get too consumed with it, like there's a demon behind every door, And I could see if you read his book, The Screwtape Letters, you could start to feel that way a little bit. I mean, life would feel a little bit like a Frank Peretti novel. Like there's something behind everything going on here, which, don't get me wrong, there is. I talked about this with political parties. Like I remember many times voting for the lesser of two evils. But the reality is there's no such thing as a lesser of two evils. There is evil. And evil loves power. And so typically the powers that be have a lot of evil behind them, regardless of political affiliation. Anyway, that's a little bit of a rabbit trail. But I don't want us to get too caught up in the demons that were connected to this guy. I think a lot of us feel like, don't talk about demons. There's no such thing as devils or demons. Well, there is. But I don't think they're behind every door either. But in this case, they were definitely plaguing this guy. And Jesus almost appears to go out of his way to deal with this guy. He's the only person that Jesus really engages in this community. And it's interesting to see what happens with this man's life. This week, I was doing a little bit of reading. An article came out, and I don't always like Desiring God. I do like Desiring God, but the publication, Desiring God, okay? It's a website, desiringgod.com, and it tends to be a little more fundamentalist than I am in my belief system. But I thought this was a really good article this week, and I would point you to it. Scott Hubbard put this article out this week, 4 Ways to Disagree Christianly. And I thought it was excellent, especially if you do anything with social media or you ever talk to people you don't agree with. Anybody ever talk to anybody you don't agree with? Yeah. At church this morning, probably, right? It just happens. Not long. You're funny. Anyway, in this article, Hubbard does a good job of talking about how we can engage with one another. And it just made me think, how can the proximity principle impact our day-to-day conversations with other people? Hubbard did a pretty good job of explaining his own ideas about this, but after reflecting a little on it, I turned to the book of Colossians, and I'd encourage you to turn there today too. Colossians chapter 3, just a maybe a page turn from where Tolly read this morning. In Colossians chapter 3, Paul is kind of transitioning. The book itself is all about the supremacy of Christ, and we listened to that beautiful hymn be read this morning from Tolly about Jesus, and that he is the image of the invisible God. And just that line itself is pretty amazing to think about. But in chapter 3, he starts to talk about how the image of the invisible God starts showing up in our life. And I want us to reflect a little on this before we break into small groups here. I just want to start by reading from Colossians 3, verse 9. Paul's talking about this new life. And earlier he said, put to death whatever belonged to your earthly nature, because you have this new nature. And I think most of us gathered here today are living in that new nature, but we remember what had to be put to death so we could live in this new nature. And there was a long list of things that he puts in there. In verse 7, he says, you used to walk in these ways in the life you once lived. And that's true for me. It's probably true for you. You walked in some of those ways. But in verse 9, he says, do not lie to each other, since you have taken off your old self with its practices and have put on the new self, which is being renewed in knowledge in the image of its creator. And I was thinking about this passage and what it has to say about this proximity principle. And I was thinking, what would life look like if when I was having a conversation with somebody I disagreed with, if I would remember that they are image bearers and that I am an image bearer? See, in Genesis chapter 1, verses 26 and 27, it says that God created us in his image. In his image, he created us. That's how he created humanity. We are image bearers. And some of you look at that, and then you look at me and you think, man, that must be one ugly God. But the reality is, it has nothing to do with physical looks. It's much bigger than that. It's about the soul. It's about who we are. And if we would look at the people around us, even the ones that we disagree with because they vote elephant instead of donkey, if we'd look at the people around us that are not white or not like us, or male versus female, or poverty versus wealth, or privilege versus oppression, if we would, instead of taking those labels to people, we would remember this simple principle from Genesis 1:26 and 27, and remember that we are image bearers. And so when we are face to face in conversation with people, we are having conversations with image bearers. And as believers, Paul talks about this, that in Christ we have this new self being renewed in the image of its creator. And so not only should we look at those people around us as image bearers, but we should remember that we, in our interactions with other people, bear the image of Christ. In other words, that person I disagree with, in my disagreement, I'm bearing the image of Christ, so I'd better disagree without being disagreeable. Does that make sense? Like, there's a way that I can disagree without humiliating those people or talking down to people. And maybe, rather than letting the disagreement or the issue rule the conversation or the relationship, maybe the image bearing should rule the relationship and the conversation. I might be the embodiment of Jesus to that person, or as my grandma used to put it years ago, you're the only Jesus some people will meet. Still true today. Some truth is really good. And so do I really want the only Jesus they ever meet to be so focused on what separates us. So I think we would do well to remember that God made us each image bearers, us and the people we disagree with. I think there's another way that this proximity principle can impact our day-to-day conversations. And I think that's just by remembering God makes us new and expects us to bear with one another. And we see this in this Colossians passage. Let's back up to what I said in verse 7. You used to walk in these ways. What were those ways? Well, he mentions a few: sexual immorality, impurity, lust, evil desires, greed, which is idolatry. Because of these, the wrath of God is coming. And I used to be like that, and you used to be like that, and Paul used to be like that, and the Colossians used to be like that. And he says, maybe we do well to remember what we were and what we're becoming. He goes on in verse 8, and he says, but now, see, that but is a huge conjunction. Or as Dwayne King, one of my mentors who's in the process of dying right now, possibly, in the hospital, Dwayne founded a ministry, an international ministry called Deaf Missions. He reaches out to deaf people all around the world. And he traveled a lot raising support for their work to create the first American Sign Language Bible, to translate the entire Bible into American Sign Language. I know it seems odd because can't deaf people read, but the reality is their language is different than our language. And so reading is very different for them. And so they did this video translation for the deaf. But Dwayne King, I remember one time he came, and Dwayne's pushing 90 now. He was probably in his early 80s when he came and preached, and he said, I just want you to circle this because this is the biggest but you'll ever see. But now you must rid yourselves of all such things. Who we were is not who we are. This is who we were, but now, Paul says, we must rid ourselves of all those things. And he puts together another list, and this one's even more targeted. You must rid yourselves of things like anger and rage and malice and slander and filthy language. Get rid of all that stuff, Paul says. Don't lie to each other, since you have taken off your old self with its practices and put on the new self, which is being renewed in knowledge in the image of its creator. Do you see what Paul's saying here? Like, we are becoming more and more in the image of our creator. Yes, we were created in the image of our creator, but sin has a way of distorting that. See, God didn't create us to lie. God didn't create us for filthy language. God didn't create us for anger. God didn't create us for filth. You have all these things that God didn't create us for, but sin brought into our life and introduced into our life. And we need to recognize that we were sinful and we still have that, and we're in the process of being made new. And in that process, God expects us to bear with one another as we're being made new. So my sin, you bear with. And your sin, I bear with. And maybe more appropriately, when you've been a believer for a while, is the scars of my sin, you bear with. And the scars of your sin, I bear with. But we bear with one another. We remember this. In our conversations, when we disagree with other people, we can do so Christianly, as that article talked about. And the way to do it Christianly is to remember that God makes us new and expects us to bear with one another. The third way this proximity principle can impact our day-to-day conversations is if we would just simply remember God's love binds us together in perfect unity. Let's continue to read this passage from verse 11 on. Here there is no Greek or Jew, circumcised or uncircumcised, barbarian, Scythian, slave or free, but Christ is all and is in all. Now understand, these were significant dividing factors in the early church. And Paul says, we're not divided by those things. Let's quit being divided by those things and recognize that we are together because Jesus Christ is all and is in all. We are his image bearers. Therefore, as God's chosen people, holy and dearly loved, clothe yourselves with compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience. Have you ever tried to fight with somebody who is filled with compassion and kindness and humility, gentleness, patience? It's not a very fun fight. They just stand there. Bear with each other, verse 13. Bear with each other and forgive whatever grievances you may have against one another. Forgive as the Lord forgave you. And over all these virtues, put on love, which binds them all together in perfect unity. Essentially, what he's saying there is remember the cross. I love what Scott Hubbard said in that article. He said, every Christian conversation about race, and you could change that word to other things that divide us. Every Christian conversation about race happens beside the spilled blood, torn flesh, and cursed cross of Jesus. You see, that person that you're separated from, let's get a little more personal. Let's say it's not just about political issues, or let's talk about personal issues. That person that you're struggling to forgive, the same spilled blood and torn flesh and cursed cross of Jesus paid for their forgiveness of sin that paid for yours, that paid for mine. The person that has sinned the most against you, caused you the most hurt, the most pain, the same cross paid for their sin that paid for yours and paid for mine. This is what it means to disagree Christianly. To recognize that there's no problem that separates us that's bigger than the cross that unites us. The story ends. This is one of my favorite stories in Scripture. I kind of wish I wouldn't have trusted the video to preach the whole thing, but the story ends this way in verses 18 and 19. As Jesus was getting into the boat, the man who had been demon-possessed begged to go with him, and Jesus did not let him go. I preached a sermon on this one time, the time Jesus said no to a man following him. Like, this is the only time I can think of where Jesus told somebody, you can't follow me. Usually he's saying, come, follow me. But in this case, he says, follow me, but stay where you are. This guy wants to get in the boat and go with Jesus. He wants to be the next Mark. He wants to be the next Matthew. I shouldn't have said Mark. He wants to be the next Peter. He wants to be the next John. He wants to be in the inner circle. He wants to be close to Jesus. He wants proximity to Jesus. And Jesus says, not you. You stay here. Now think about it. You stay here. Why? This guy doesn't have a friend in town. Matter of fact, in the Decapolis, these 10 communities that he was a part of, there wasn't anybody that would come out and take care of him and be with him other than to chain him back up. Maybe wrap a robe around him occasionally. And Jesus says, your work is here. He said, go home to your own people and tell them how much the Lord has done for you and how he has had mercy on you. Jesus knew that this man was going to make a big difference. Look at the difference he made. So the man went away and began to tell in the Decapolis, these 10 cities, how much Jesus had done for him, and all the people were amazed. Why? Because a crazy, naked, demon-possessed guy was telling stories. He was talking, he was dressed, he was human, and he had an amazing story to tell that wasn't really just about him, but about Jesus. And so all of the differences and all of the things that once separated this man from his community, they paled in comparison to the story he had to tell about Jesus. And my guess is they pale in comparison in your life too. If we could somehow remember that it's this cursed cross, this torn flesh, this spilt blood that gave us the freedom we have, the life that we have, what kind of a difference could that make in the lives of the people around us? But it starts, like we talked about last week, it starts in us, showing that kind of gratitude, letting Christ change us. Last week, we broke into discussion groups. We're going to do that again. And I asked you to think about what fruit you needed to grow in this week. This week, as you go around the table in your groups, or if you end up staying in your chair, whatever group you gather with, I'd like you to talk about that. Did God give you an opportunity to grow in that fruit this week? I'd encourage you to try and be with the people you were with last week. If they're not here, get with some other people. But the second thing I'd like you to talk about, so not just the fruit that you grew in this week, the second thing I'd like you to talk about is this prayer that this young lady, Brittany, had that said, God, would you let me come across some broken people this week? And I want you to reflect in your groups a little bit. Just tell a story about a time that you came across somebody who was broken and hurting. Whether you did something about it or not, just where were you the last time you were around somebody who was broken and hurting? And ask yourselves, is this proximity principle that Kyle introduced to us today, is it true? Can we just sit at home or sit in our church building or sit in wherever we sit the most and expect to come across broken and hurting people that need Jesus? So I want you to pray that as you leave today. Talk about that principle and then pray for one another that God would help you to encounter broken people this week. Let's pray together before you move into your group. Father, you came near and you changed history with your presence. And you didn't just change history, you changed every life in this room. God, help us to bear your image well with one another and with those in our community. And God, bring us across people this week that are broken and hurting, that we might bear your image with them as well. In Jesus' name, amen. Would you...